Hello, and welcome to our fourth session for today. This is, of course, English 303, Composition 2. I'm so happy that you're able to join us today. We've got a whole host of students today. I think we've got, I don't know, like 15 participants today. That's great. That's almost the entire class. So I'm glad to see you all here. I'm going to quickly share a screen with you back to our course website and just go over our agenda for today and then open up the forum to questions. If you have any questions right away, you can use the chat feature. It should be off to your right on your menu displays. Go ahead and chat with me, send a question if you have concerns. And then I'll make sure everybody's unmuted. Okay, let's see here. All right, let's go to the announcements page. Session 4 for today. As you can see, we've got to do a little bit of preview and review of material that we've covered already. And then I'm going to go ahead and break into some of these new topics. Specifically today, in terms of review and preview, we have broken up the Chapter 2 material into a couple of incremental discussion points. About 15 minutes today, just talking about thinking and reading critically. What does it mean to think critically? What does it mean to read critically? And then pursuant to that, what does it mean to read actively? What are some strategies that you use or that you have been successful with in the past when it relates to your ability to read actively and get more out of a particular text or assigned reading? Then I want to spend a little bit of time near the end of today's session thinking about critical responses. What is included when you're writing an effective critical response? All right. Now, in terms of review, last time during session 3, we talked about the 4 pillars of argument. And we said that a firm argument has to have or include at least 4 distinct elements. Specifically, we have to have a thesis statement. And we explained, or we discussed last time, I explained and we discussed the ideas of opening any kind of writing with a type of funnel-like introduction, meaning that we start with the most general sense of information and we narrowed that information down into a very specific detail. That most specific detail, of course, being the thesis statement itself. And the thesis statement, as we described last time, is just a way to signal to your audience and explain to them what the point or purpose of your writing is. Now, once you've developed your thesis statement, you have to support that thesis statement with specific evidence. Most of the time, when you're writing a response or when you're constructing a written argument, that material is going to take the place of a series of evidentiary explanations that are introduced in the first paragraph, but later expanded upon to greater detail in the body paragraphs that will compose your written essay. Last but not least, before we move to the conclusion, we should put some space aside for a refutation, meaning we should, as good writers of an argument, structure a point in our paper in which we pivot to consider the other side of the argument. That does 3 things for us. Number 1, it helps us to earn the ethos that the audience has invested within us as a sense of authority. We consider, number 2, the other side of this argument so that our own argument, our own position, feels more well-rounded. We're not just expounding upon our points. We're actually trying to have a discussion in which we consider the other alternative perspective. And lastly, it allows us one more opportunity to prove why we are correct, or why our audience should take a specific course of action, or why they should adopt our view, or at least consider our view in addition to some other perspective. Once we've taken time to offer up a refutation for the other perspective position or positions for a given argument, it's then time to construct a conclusion. And we said that, like the inverse of a funnel, oftentimes we have a pyramid-shaped conclusion where we restate a very specific point, the thesis, and then we expand our conclusion to have more general information, including summarizing the critical points that we've tried to develop as our evidence, and ending with either a call to action or some sort of last statement to get our audience thinking about these perspectives. So that is a quick review of what we discussed last time. You also had a week 2 discussion board thread that you could have responded to. And just real quickly, in case you haven't had a chance to look at that this week, here's our week 2 discussion board question. Think about a time that you have been persuaded to see the other side of an argument. Answer the following questions. What was the initial argument about? Describe it briefly. What was your position at first, and how do you feel it is that you formed that perspective? Then think back. What was it that made you change your mind or simply consider your perspective? How is it that you were persuaded to do so? And did the presenter of the refutation give a counter argument for the other view or the other perspective? Now, there may be a chance that you've never experienced this, or you've never been convinced to take up another perspective. If not, I have an alternate set of questions for you to consider. Summarize the topic briefly again, but then ask, how do you feel you formed that perspective? And then imagine it were possible for you to be persuaded. What kind of evidence would be necessary to sell you on that concept? And what sticking points could you not imagine backing away from, no matter what that other person had tried to convince you of? Okay, let me just click back real quickly to the announcements. We may need to return to this page. Okay, I'm going to stop our share for today. And then I'm going to make sure that, let's see here, I think, let's unmute. Okay. Let's see here. Unmute. So everybody should be unmuted now, I think. If not, you may unmute your microphones. Go ahead and do that. If you need me to do it, I think I can do that too, but just let me know if you have any trouble. And you can just send me a message in the chat if that's the case. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
Okay, so let's talk about chapter 2 today. This was kind of a broken up series of readings. And as I said last time, it was fine if you read the little articles that went along with this chapter. In fact, it would probably even be to your benefit to do so, but you were not required to read those little articles. Basically, we have material from pages 59 to about 63 talking about thinking critically, ways to become an active reader. A lot of review material in these first pages. And then over on page 70, after some sample articles, we picked up a little bit of information about annotating. And then toward the very end of the chapter, pages 77 to 78, we get a little section about writing and critical response. So let's start real generally then on page 60 with this section called Thinking Critically. Now, if you have your text, you can pull it out. If not, that's okay. You can just go ahead and follow along with us. So they start with this idea about thinking critically. So they have a text definition, and they say, and I'm going to read right from the text here. When you think critically, you do not simply accept the ideas that are offered to you at face value. Instead, you question the ideas, analyzing them in order to understand them better. Does this match up with your definition of thinking critically?
Yes.
Okay, was that Kevin?
Best if you're a good thinker and you're.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Sonia.
I think if you know how to rightfully divide and think about what a person is saying without just believing everything you hear, yeah, it can be critical, a way of critical thinking. You have to not just believe everything you hear, you have to weigh it out first and see where it's going.
Okay, yeah. And I would suggest that even to be a good consumer, a consumer who knows his or her own rights and who thinks critically about their purchases, you're going to have to master the skill at one point or other, right? Otherwise, you'd be buying into every quick, get rich quick scheme that someone offered you on late night television, right? Now, we are all fairly adverse to those kinds of attempts to get our money at this stage of the game, but some of us, and I'm going to include myself here, probably had to learn at least once or twice about how you need to think critically or else you'll get burned. Has anyone, I'm going to date myself pretty badly here. Has anyone ever fallen for the Columbia House records or CD scam? Did anybody run up a pretty big bill for that when they were in their teenage years? No? Oh.
I don't think I ever heard of that.
Well,
yeah, you should tell us what that is exactly.
Well, I can say this. I went to attempt to order one of those, like the soul thing with all the.
Oh, sure.
And my mother said, "Look at the price. You could go to the store; it's cheaper."
Mm-hmm.
The pack. You know how much it costs each month.
Yeah, and this is a good example of reading the fine print. So Columbia House was notorious in the mid to late 90s. And before Columbia House, there were other versions of this sort of thing around. And they would offer you an incredible deal. Comic books and Rolling Stone magazine in particular were notorious for offering this ad. And what it was is it was just an advertisement that said, all right, pick out 20, I think it was either 12 or 20 CDs. And we didn't have the ability to digitally download music at that point. It was coming. It was a few years off still. But they said, they were still selling CDs. And they said, you can have 12, I think it was, for free if you just fill out this coupon and mail it to us. And everybody jumped on that, and they got either 12 or 15. Sometimes, like I said, there were a couple out there for advertising 20 of these CDs that you could get just for writing into Columbia House. What they did not explain was that while you got, yeah, you're okay. A couple of you have heard of this, yeah. While you got your 20 CDs, they took your information and logged you into a system, and then they kept sending you CDs of the type or variety that you liked. For example, Sonia remembered there was a soul specific group of ads. Alternative rock was big when I was a kid. That was what they focused on, and they would just send you these CDs. But after the first free 20 or 12, then they start to charge you each week, and they would charge usually your parents' credit card, because we didn't always have access to our own credit cards. So this was a pretty good scam. And what
Being
would
a little sneaky.
right. So we didn't necessarily read the fine print.
You little devil, you.
Exactly. So our parents would usually have to explain this to us. Sometimes that included a penalty, sometimes it did not. I was fortunate in that they explained it to me. I was the fifth of 5 kids, so my parents had an occasion to go through this before. But some of my other friends who were going through this for the first time, their parents were not too happy. So thinking critically, to relate back to our text for just a moment.
I wonder why.
Yeah. Thinking critically is a way of analyzing an argument or analyzing any kind of new information that you would be offered in this class or from another instructor, just to encourage you to think about where their information is generated from and how likely it is to be true and how applicable it is to our own perspective. And I'll say that last part again. How applicable is it to our own world? Because even textbooks like this one, Practical Thinking, which offers, pretty timeless advice, may be dated, in light of a post-COVID-19 world, especially since a lot of our discussions, we're entering into a political season. Even our political seasons and our political sorts of debates and arguments are happening in mediums that are no longer as traditional as they once were. So I expect to see all of these types of texts edited.
Anymore? I don't know.
Sorry about that.
Oh, there he is.
Okay.
There he is.
He is here somewhere.
Wow, yeah. I'm here. I don't know. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You came in and out for a second.
I think it switches between people who are talking.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Good. That's fine. I don't have an issue with that. But in any event, I expect to see all these texts.
You also have the applicable part.
Yeah. I expect that we'll see texts like this one edited in the very near future, so that we can have a more applicable sense of how we have different delivery systems for these various types of arguments. Now, one question I'm going to ask, and anybody who would like to respond may do so. How do you balance thinking critically against believing anything? Is that what the texts or the authors of our text intend, that you should question every single thing that you read, or that your instructor, or that that your political appointees tell you? Or are they thinking about something a little bit different?
Yeah. You're freezing again.
I'm freezing?
You're freezing again. I didn't catch any of the question.
Oh, okay. So just to repeat that question, and I'll put it on chat too. Should we believe, or should we question rather, everything that we are told?
Yes.
Well, seeing as you likely looked up something that's probably similar to this in the past, I mean, maybe not. But like you said, if it's applicable to what's going on, and you came across these several times of a similar situation, then to hear it again is like,
Okay. Okay. I can see that. So again, just to reiterate,
Right.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Make sure I can understand exactly what I was interpreting there. Devin suggested that
yeah.
you should question a lot of things initially, unless you yourself find the evidence to be repeated multiple times in support of that position. Is that right?
That sounds
Yeah,
right.
like
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Devin. Sonia, I'll get right back over to you. Go ahead, Devin.
no, that was it. That was it.
Okay. What else, Sonia? Help us out.
Get it
Sonia.
right.
I just believe, but I mean, you have to question things. You can't believe everything you hear. It has to be some validation, some truth to it.
Yeah.
Other than that, you could fall for anything, as they say, propaganda, conspiracy, all of those things. So you have to question what's out there and what's being presented to you at all times, because again, this will make or break an argument in
Yep.
any form or fashion.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a chess match.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really good metaphor. What can you expound upon that?
It's like a chess match. Like you have the pieces in front of you, and they're set a certain way. You may think that, oh, I'm just gonna move my knight to d6 real quick, thinking that, oh, I'm gonna pull a fast one. Lo and behold, you left yourself open, wide open for your rook to just charge right to your back line.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Every time someone presents an argument, it's very akin to them making a thought out move in a larger discussion. So gathering your own evidence, or at least doing some fact checking, I think is necessary. Now, of course, I'm going to say this because
Yeah.
I'm an instructor, but most of the information that I'm going to pull from, at least in these first few weeks, is going to be directly from the text. So you'll have your own sort of opportunity to fact check what it is I'm saying. But sorry, Lucas, I cut you off. What were you going to say?
No, I was just gonna kind of add to what Devin and you were kind of saying, and like just say you got to use kind of the information that you've kind of gathered yourself, like, and apply that to what you're reading. So like use your own kind of background knowledge when you're kind of like reading something, or trying to determine like, the validity of something, or like if you should be questioning it. Like, is it something that matches up with what you've heard before, or is it something new, or is it something that has been going around and being talked about, like different little things, like you just have to know, like from your own experiences and stuff.
Mm-hmm. I'm just typing something out
That
here.
was all I had. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. So I just wanted to post that in the chat, and I'll repeat it. Lucas raises another really great point, which is just to say that our own experience can also be brought to bear anytime that we're asked to consider a potential argument. And I would ask you to agree or disagree with that idea. I, for one, I feel that, like I said, that is a good point. So that's another way to, analyze or gauge the merit of a potential argument, because you have a certain level of innate knowledge and a certain level of learned knowledge that you can apply to any given situation or any given perspective. So those things those innate pieces of knowledge or learned pieces of knowledge are also relevant to a debated question or topic. Okay, this was good. Before we leave this topic and move on to reading critically, anything else that you want to add or that anybody wants to say about thinking critically?
Yeah, to Lucas's point about like your own experiences, like say something went wrong in the past and you just like have a hard time like kind of believing it, like going through with it in the future.
Yeah, it's well said.
Yeah. For that.
Okay, let's move on to a
So, Father, I'm
sub.
wondering if you could touch on bias a little.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to flip ahead in our text just a moment, and if you want to follow along with me, you can do so. Let's see real quick. Bias shows up on I just want to get that right page. Oh, where'd you go? Right there on 61 near the bottom. And in reading critically, they explain that you should also consider your opposing arguments carefully, weighing them against the arguments developed in your sources. And we talked about that a little bit last time. But you should try to watch out when you are creating an argument for possible bias in your sources and work hard to keep your own biases in check. So a bias is simply a predisposition for agreement with one perspective or another. A good example that I use in real life is that because I have several nieces, nephews, many of whom over the past few years have learned to drive, and they're now focusing on purchasing their first cars. And I have learned that I should tell them, or I feel I should say that I should tell them that they should look for the best and safest economical car to purchase, and that if possible, they may want to consider a hybrid vehicle or a vehicle that has an alternative fuel source. But that's a bias on my part because I think that that's something we should all be relatively aware of. And of course, they're very quick to say, but Uncle John, you don't drive an alternative fuel vehicle. You drive a muscle car, which is the antithesis, right? I drive a Ford Mustang. And they say, that's the antithesis of what you're recommending. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's true. But I also justify that because even when I was commuting back and forth to work, I was only on the road typically 2 out of 5 days, 2 days out of 7. Maybe 3, if I took in a weekend excursion. So I was able in my own mind to justify that. But I had a bias, a predisposition toward suggesting that they have an alternative fuel car, typically because they're a little bit safer and they have less of a negative impact in terms of their carbon footprint that they leave. Okay? So that's an example, of a bias. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but being aware of how you feel, especially if you feel strongly about a specific topic, is not a bad thing to have some degree of awareness about. In fact, it could actually help you in the long term. Does that make more sense, Kevin?
I'm getting there. I guess I'm still not seeing it more in a simple term. You're saying that you have a bias because you want them to be safe. Is that what you're saying? Because they're your nieces and nephews.
Kind of car they choose.
Yeah, it's more about the kind of car that they choose, and that I want them to make a choice that's not necessarily, it's not as, I have an agenda. I'll say it like that. I have an agenda. I want them to help reduce fuel emissions. And as such, I would steer them away perhaps from a type of car that they may want toward a type of car that I would suggest would be better for them and better for the environment in the long term. So I'm not saying you should buy a car based on.
But do you have a real legitimate argument seeing that you drive a Mustang?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that the biased argument that kind of comes in is sorry, I don't mean to be cutting you guys off.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Sorry about that.
Go ahead.
I was thinking that kind of the argument to be made, like especially on Mr. Fowler's part, was just more of like, I don't want to say that was kind of the time thing, but you know, like the environmental kind of like policies and like awareness have like definitely become like much more of like a spotlight kind of concern, and like before they weren't as much. And so I think, you know, like the bias comes from growing up like in a time where it wasn't as a big of a concern, like, and I think now that, you know, like they do have like safer, more efficient, and just like some people don't consider them as fun, you know, but they're definitely just overall like some people would say better in the sense for the, like, you know, the environment and safety and all the other stuff. So again, like I think that does play into like the bias, and like you're saying, Kevin, about how like he does like care for his nieces and nephews and stuff. So I think that would like be a pretty good argument to say like a different type of bias, but still bias nonetheless.
So he's got a bias because he formed that agenda and he's pushing the agenda. He's not arguing for their benefit of why they should get that car. He's
Right.
just saying that he's pushing the agenda of one.
Now you've got it, Kevin. Now you've got it. It's
Okay.
more about how I feel about the car as opposed to any sort of logic-based argument that I'm handing to them. It's a more of a personal feeling.
And I think
Go ahead, Lucas.
yeah, and I think again that has a lot to do with like your experiences and like things that you've come to be comfortable with, and like different just things that have played like a role in your life. And like it's again why some people prefer like, you know, vanilla over chocolate, or like, you know, something like that, because maybe they had a bad experience one time or something, you know. So that may or may not lead to like a certain amount of bias towards certain things as well.
It's not the logic. I'm going a little too far here, but it's less about the well, not ethos. It's less logos and more kind of torn up in pathos, like emotional. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. And so to go back to Sonia, what Sonia was saying a few minutes ago, that's exactly why I picked this example, because as she said, you don't create the best, Mr. Fowler, you don't create the best foundation for your argument, because it's a kind of an instance of do as I say, not as I do. And that's exactly true. So she brings up
And then I
a
have
point.
to look at how old is your car and when did you purchase your car?
It's
you know about all this emission, all this good driving. How old is your Mustang? When did if you purchased it as this 1970? You know.
Oh, I'm sorry, you cut
Does
out
it
there. If you purchased it, what?
Yeah.
When did you purchase the car?
2009.
So it's fairly new.
Yeah, it's fairly
Not
new.
an old car. You know everything. So, and you're giving this advice, yet you're not taking it yourself. You lost the bias argument.
That's right. And not too shockingly, right? One of my nephews drives a Mustang. So, yeah, he said, no, this doesn't equate. I'm going to drive a Mustang. And so we both drive similar blue Mustangs around. I like to pretend that sometimes I can be mistaken for him, but that again is probably not an argument based in any kind of logic. Okay. So if we read critically, that's just applying the same sort of critical thinking skills to any time we are a reader. And they suggest, they being Kersner and Mandel, our authors, they suggest that there are a couple of techniques that you can use when reading. Now, there are some of these techniques that I'll be honest with you, I do not always engage in when I'm reading. And more to the point, thinking back to the dark days when I was in college, I didn't always practice these critical reading steps. But I did practice a few of them. And the first one that they suggest is on page 62, and that is previewing. And I did preview instinctively. That is probably due to my exposure of various textbooks over the years being set up in the same way, where they'll have key points at the beginning of a chapter, and then they'll have various different section headings that, and I just, by nature, got used to reading through a chapter first. And the reason I did that, especially when I was a younger person in high school and in early years of college, was because I thought if I read through the chapter first, it wasn't a benign sense of trying to think critically. It was because I thought there's probably less that I would need to read if I skim the chapter first, so I could focus on the most interesting points or details. It just developed as a habit in that way. So real quickly, let's talk just a little bit about previewing a piece of reading or a piece of writing. Do any of you preview your texts for this or for other classes?
Sometimes,
From time to time.
Go ahead, Devin.
sometimes I should do it all the time. That way it would give me an idea of what's really going on and what I'm supposed to be doing, and I can sort of somewhat contribute to the conversation. But I think if you don't preview it, you're not really aware of what you're getting into.
Right. I feel that when I don't know if this is true of you or not, but when I don't preview, then I can kind of lose the focus when I'm
I
actually.
can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I find that is that any better? How about now?
Yes.
Okay.
You're good. There we go.
When I preview, or when I rather don't preview, then I find myself reading for longer periods of time because I go back and check to make sure that my focus is where it should be and that I'm truly absorbing information. So I think previewing, as you said, Sonia, is a really good topic or a good habit to get into. Anybody else preview or have experience previewing a text?
Yeah, for pretty much all the classes, that I've taken throughout school, you pretty much, like you said, just kind of get like a little bit of a habit of it, just to not shortcut the work, but sometimes,
Yeah, or I don't think shortcutting the work. Sometimes, I'll be honest, for me, that's how it felt in the beginning. But then I would focus my attention on certain things, and certain parts of an argument or a discussion were not as interesting as others. So one of the ways that I have enhanced my reading and learning over the years is to focus on the elements that stand out to me. And then I can usually rely on either my instructor or more frequently my other classmates to bring up points that I had not considered. Okay, moving
Mr.
on.
Fowler, is it such a thing like you're going on?
No,
What if
go
you
ahead.
have a short attention span like I do? You get bored very easily and you
Yes.
can't focus.
no.
What do you do?
That's great. So if you cannot focus, I suggest using the 25-minute method. There are other names for it, but I first encountered it as a 25-minute method, which is just that you look at a given piece of reading or a given piece of study time or whatever the case may be, and you focus on it for exactly 25 minutes. And sometimes that's too long for participants when they start using the technique, but it's a good earmark, so good that it, like I said, sometimes has lent its name to this practice. And then after 25 minutes, you close the book and either move on to a different topic of study, or you just take a break. And I recommend taking a break, even if it's just to walk around or check in with your family or the people that you work with, whatever the case may be, or wherever your reading space is. And then go back to the reading if you didn't finish it, and then focus on that for only another 25 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the next section is just critical reading, and they ask you to just apply the critical thinking strategies that we've already discussed to the reading process. The last bit is highlighting, and that starts on page 67. And here's one where this may be a boon to you to annotate or highlight certain portions of a text that you're reading. I have to be honest with you. I did not highlight a lot of text or go through and read text when I was in college. I find that as a professor, I do that more frequently. So you should probably try this technique if you've never tried it before. And if it works for you, wonderful. And if it doesn't make a difference, I'll leave it up to you as to whether or not you should, continue. So anybody do this actively though already? Anybody read and highlight a text as they're reading?
Sometimes.
Sometimes,
Mostly for
Jennifer?
like science kind of books and stuff.
Yeah, sometimes, but not very often.
Okay. It depends on the subject.
Once
I
you
can see
find
that.
it, you put your answer down.
What's
Yeah,
that?
it depends.
Like,
Sorry, for
Like
Devin.
once you find it, you just put your answer down.
Okay, good. What
Oh,
else,
sorry.
Jennifer?
It depends on the subject, like you said. So
Okay. Yeah, it could vary depending upon the subject. Some subjects may be more difficult to focus on than others. And this goes along with annotating on page 70. So they explain here, and I'm gonna read from the text for just a few seconds. As you highlight, you should also annotate what it is you're reading. Annotation means making notes with questions, reactions, and ideas for discussion or writing in the margins or between the lines. Devin, this goes back to what you were referencing a minute ago, that sometimes you write down answers. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
Like depending, like okay, there's a question related to the text, and like once you find it, and you just go ahead and just write it down already.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Especially if the chapter features key questions at the beginning, that's a great way to sort of search and find places to annotate answers, or even just underline or make a symbol that suggests, here's an answer. Or if you've got questions about the actual answer you find, it's another good way to keep track of what it is you're thinking about. And that's part of, by the way, of why textbooks are set up the way they are, with lots of what they call negative space on a given page, so that you can make those kinds of notes and ask those kinds of questions in the margin. A lot of students I know think, I may decrease the resale value of a textbook if I annotate or highlight. That's possible. But
Yeah, honestly, this is
go ahead.
Some
this
people
one
might pay
person
more.
written it a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, a couple of times actually.
And when I purchased textbooks, I actually looked for textbooks that had annotations or that had a lot of highlighting. So a lot of the work would be done for me. But I think yeah. I think that's what you were saying too, Lucas.
I'm mad about that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. Like some people specifically look for like people who take good notes so
Yeah.
they can buy their books so they don't have to take as many notes.
Absolutely. What else, Andrea?
Oh, I was just laughing.
Oh, okay. Okay. We're almost there for today. We've got about 20 more minutes. So I want to talk about a couple of different things. Near the end of the chapter on page 77, they introduce this concept about writing a critical response. And again, a little bit from the text, it says that sometimes you'll be asked to write a critical response, which could be as little as a paragraph, or even sometimes a little bit more, in which you analyze ideas presented in an argument and express your reactions to them. So they give you a couple of tips or suggestions for writing a critical response. Now, most of the time, you already have a critical response. By this stage, you've already had plenty of opportunity to write critical responses. Theoretically, the writings that you respond to in the thread of discussion are all forms of critical response. So if you want to think about this particular section of the text as a way to help you respond more thoroughly to any of those questions. Most of the time, I'm going to, in these early weeks, I'm going to ask lots of questions that have specific components to them to sort of push you to write a little bit more. But as we move ahead, you may note that especially as we get into some of our other texts, I ask more open-ended questions. So this portion is particularly interesting in my vein of thought because it actually suggests some strategies to help you think around the ways that you could respond. Now, many of you probably already do several of these things or potentially all of these things, but I just wanted to cover a couple of them. So they suggest that before you begin to write your critical argument, or sorry, a critical response to an argument, you should consider some questions. And the first one is to begin by identifying your source and its author. Now, why do you think that would be important in a critical response?
Isn't that like,
Maybe we should really be using this raise hand button more.
Yes. Go ahead. Let's start with Sonia, and then we'll go back to Devin. Go ahead, Sonia.
when we look at the triangle of the ethos and the pathos and the message and the audience, you start off with that,
Yeah.
what you just said.
Absolutely. One really obvious point, in addition to what Sonia said, I'll offer one obvious point, which is that you should always practice writing, even if it's for a class and you have a specific audience. It's always a good idea to practice assuming that your writing could have a life beyond its initial creation, so that once you are no longer available for a response or explanation, your writing should be able to stand on its own, which includes being accommodating for your audience by explaining what the situation is, as Sonia points out. So accommodate your audience, but also explain the rhetorical situation, because that's just a good way to earn your audience's respect and justify the authority they're investing in you as an author. Devin, what else?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, yeah, the author, you can probably like look them up, see how credible of the author is and the things they write, and like you can probably look back through those writing to see if there's like any form of biases or what are their overall beliefs.
Absolutely, because if you can indicate a bias or expose a predilection toward a specific belief, you can use that to disarm your opponent's position. And that's a good way to analyze a text in preparation for adding and making a more verbose argument. Good pickup there. Now, beyond that, they also suggest that you analyze their supporting points one by one, considering the strength of the evidence. This is pretty self-explanatory. If you're going to try to dismantle an argument, you're going to need to address every point. Make sure that you understand what it is they're trying to say in each point. You should also consider whether or not the writer addresses significant opposing arguments. This is a good idea. Why might that be helpful to you?
Say it again.
Why might it be helpful to see if they have anticipated opposing arguments? We've talked about this as a suggestion that we should adhere to when we're writing. If we flip the script for a little bit and now we are reading, now we're the audience, why might it be important to note what strategies they try to refute?
I think I go back to the whole chess match thing. Like, if you're aware of the situations before you, like again, that rook in the back line waiting to charge in, you may not want to be like too quick to move that knight to d6. You may want to like try to either bait out other situations in order to push to your advantage and not give your opponent that advantage over you.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah, you may
Yeah.
not want to give that opponent an advantage over you. By knowing what they've tried to out-argue, you can look for flaws in their defense. What else, Lucas?
Yeah, kind of as you were just saying, that if you can kind of figure out the like evidence that can kind of dismantle what they use to support their argument,
Mm-hmm.
then it gives you the clear advantage in your argument of, like rejecting why their argument isn't, like a valid one, or it's not to be like taken as seriously by others, because like you're providing all the evidence that kind of sweeps out the supports from under their argument. And if you can kind of figure out what that information is, then your argument event like is going to be the winner, I guess.
Sure.
I don't know what the term for that would be.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things, and it's not to disparage anything that you said, because I thought that was all really well. Those were good points, and they were well put. You brought up one little thing that you kind of stumbled on at the end there, and you said, I think that's how you win. And a lot of the times when we think about debates, when we think about arguments or discussions, either written or oral, we think about whether or not we win or whether the other person wins. And that's natural. But I think more often,
That's like persuading the person to like gain your opinion, right? Like
Yeah,
you
or-
want the other person to be convinced that you're right.
yeah, or you encourage them to take a specific action. But I think more often than not, the victory as it is comes in just getting them to consider another perspective. Oftentimes they won't actually act, or they won't necessarily completely agree. But if you can get them at least to back off of an ardent position, especially if the position is potentially dangerous to yourself or to society in general, you can call that a win, even if it doesn't seem like you've actually convinced them to completely agree. There was a great example in the
It's
discussion.
not about winning. It's
Right,
about
yeah.
sending a message.
Right. There was a great example in the thread of discussion for this class where someone said, they had gotten into a discussion on Facebook with a friend, and they couldn't get that person to come away from their they had put a lot of emphasis completely in the hands of a particular government agency. And they said, well, I at least was able to gain some sort of success by getting them to back off and admit that this government agency wasn't perfect. And to me, that's success. You've created a dialogue, and you've had a discussion, and you've presented an argument that's made someone at least concede a portion of what they had believed. And that can be a moment of success. Go ahead.
Yeah, and as long as it wasn't violent, that's a W too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, a couple more things on a critical response to wrap up. They also suggest, and again, that you quote, summarize, and paraphrase the writer's key points as you go along. And they say, being careful to quote or paraphrase in a way as to not misrepresent the other writer's perspective. That is very, very important, especially more so for our position as student writers. Why do you think the authors would put such an emphasis on that point?
Because you won't plagiarize and get caught up and messed up.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah.
I've
I
often
was thinking more for like the argumentative purposes of like not trying to discredit someone who does have credit as like a student, you know, someone who's just forming like their kind of like not like professional opinions, but like people who are just getting into like being able to form an opinion, even if that makes sense.
Right. And as we evolve as writers, sometimes we run up against arguments
Yeah.
that are difficult to respond to. What if someone crouches an entire argument in a doctrine of religious belief? That's tough, you know, especially if you're not familiar with the tenets of that specific belief system. So if someone argues a point from, say, a Buddhist perspective, there may be some active Buddhists among us. So, if that's the case, you know, that's wonderful. But I would just use that as an example of a doctrine of religious belief that I'm not particularly well versed in. So if I was going to argue a topic with someone who is basing a lot of their perspective from those tenets of belief, I'd have to do a little bit more research, number one. And number two, I would have to be careful to make sure that I didn't misrepresent their perspective. So I think that's another important factor to consider, in addition to what Lucas mentioned, which is just that a lot of times for student argumentation, they may be using personal perspectives, or they may be utilizing various ideologies that they themselves are just, you know, finding out about for the first time. So it's important that you don't misrepresent the writer. And going back to Sonia's piece, it's important that you don't plagiarize yourself and that you learn to summarize effectively so that your words are not confused with the words of an author that you're either confronting or that you're using as a support for your own position. Very good. Okay. So at this point, I will pause and see if there are any questions. We have about 10 more minutes. Any questions that you have about anything
At this point,
Can you say
we
that
have
again?
further time.
Sorry, one more time.
Never mind. Sorry, you're freezing there for a
Oh.
moment.
Yeah, it
Okay.
cut out pretty
Yeah.
bad.
So I was just, am I good now? Can you hear me
Yeah,
now?
you're good.
Okay. I was just going to say,
Yep.
let's pause and see if you all have questions.
Nope,
I'm
none for
good
me.
for now.
Good.
I'm good so far.
Okay. Kyle, any questions yet? Or Caitlin?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right.
I'm good.
Okay. So I'll just summarize a couple of our key points from today. Number one, when you think critically, you're thinking in a dynamic way that embraces active learning. You want to ask questions because information that's presented to you may not be completely authentic. There may be a degree of spin that is used, and there may be some degree of bias, either minute or significant, that you're going to need to consider when a source is trying to convince you of their perspective and when you have to argue against that. Specifically, detecting things like bias can pre-arm you to create a better counter argument, especially if you're on the opposing side of that particular perspective. Now, because you have to use so many sources that are written, it's a good idea to also read critically. And when you read critically, you should do a couple of things. You should preview any source of reading that you're asked to consider. You should read closely and highlight specific details within that text. And lastly, you should go back and annotate or take notes about that text. Specifically, take notes about anything that you have questions about, or that the logic of which you find dubious, and find answers in the text that respond to discussion or guided questions if you're talking about a textbook. Lastly, when you're writing a critical analysis or critical response, it could be up to a paragraph in length or potentially even more. And you should consider all of the points of the writer carefully. You should summarize their points and ideas meticulously to make sure that you're understanding their concepts. And you should begin by remembering to orient your audience, meaning let them in on what the rhetorical context in question really is. Explain how they should or why they should believe in your position, what kind of logical arguments you're going to present, and then try to use that to convince them to take action or at least consider your perspective. All right, that's a review of everything that we wanted to talk about today.
Uh-oh.
It just cut out again.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to conclude by, can you get me now?
Oh.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha.
I was just going to conclude by saying that's just a summary of what we talked about today. So this is Mr. Fowler. I'm going to sign off. I invite anybody who wants to ask any other specific questions. You can stay logged in. But other than that, that's it for me for today. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you next week.
All right.
I'll wait.
Bye.
Join
Yeah.
us.
If you're